Hi and welcome to STEM Ambassadors Live, and today I'm joined by Stephen Ashworth. Stephen is a Professor of Chemical Physics and Science Communication at the University of East Anglia. I'm going to hand over to you now, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa, and welcome. As you see, I'm going to be talking about communicating science, and I thought it would be fun to talk about my journey from WI to NZ. As you've heard, my name's Stephen Ashworth, spelled Stephen with a PH because I'm a chemist, and I'm a Professor of Chemical Physics and Science Communication here at UEA, the University of East Anglia. So what I'm going to cover in this talk, which should be relatively swift, I hope, is my career so far, how I started in the science communication field, and tell you a bit about where it's taken me, quite literally. So my career so far, I started off at school. I liked science, found it came relatively straightforward to me. So I did 4 A-levels, maths, physics, chemistry, and biology, as you see. And I went on to study chemistry at university. I liked it so much that I then went on to do a doctorate, and that was in physical chemistry. So not necessarily making new molecules, but finding out how molecules behave when you shine light on them, things like that. That led me to do work after the doctorate, which is called postdoc work. And that was in Boulder, Colorado, at a place called the Joint Institute for Laboratory Astrophysics, which is partly at the university and partly at the National Institute for Standards and Technology there. After that, I secured another postdoc to work in Berlin. This was a much more physics-based posting, but again, I was working with lasers, shining light on molecules and solids to find out what happened in them. After Berlin, I got a fellowship to work at Bristol, and that was my first independent post where I wasn't working for somebody. I was doing my own research, doing my own work, and that's when I started teaching. And after that, I became a lecturer in chemistry at UEA. And because my family is in this area of the country and I grew up here, I have had no reason to move from teaching chemistry at UEA for the last 20 years. And I have worked my way through the career stages to be a professor. So science communication is something that we can trace back to ancient times. If we're really strict on the definition of communicating some sort of knowledge that we now see as science, because in Greek and Roman times, and even before that, the term scientist hadn't been thought up. But science communication, when you say that now, you don't think of learning something in a lecture or learning something at school, even though that is communicating science. You tend to think of something like a demonstration lecture or a popular science book. And the demonstration lecture can be traced back to around the 19th century. And this gentleman we see a picture of is Michael Faraday. And he kicked this off with the Christmas lectures at the Royal Institution. And what we find is that he is responsible for the first one-way street in England. Now there's a good pub quiz answer for you. Albemarle Street that leads in front of the Royal Institution was made one way because of the carriages, the traffic congestion from the horse-drawn carriages in that street when his lectures were on. And he kicked off these Christmas lectures. And this is where Faraday used to lecture. It's the same lecture theatre. And I've actually lectured in there a couple of times. It's a really, really lovely place to speak in. And he is very famous for his series of lectures on the chemical history of a candle. Looks at the candle and the wax and all the chemical changes and the physical changes that go on. And there's a book. If you're interested, you can buy the book and read essentially an account of those lectures. And so we trace back the modern demonstration lecture, which now you might call a science show as well. We trace that back to him. And what we tend to think of as science communication is shown in the picture on the right of the screen here. You have the scientists. They need to communicate with science journalists. They need to communicate with their press officers who communicate with science journalists. Sometimes the scientists communicate directly to the other actors. It may be you as a member of the public. It may be some group, a pressure group, maybe group of interested individuals. And so in the 20th century, and certainly the late 20th century, this has grown immensely. So science communication, there's a whole industry, if you like, now of blogs, books, social media, festivals. Everyone's communicating their science, and that there was a big impetus for this from the people that fund science from government money to have scientists justify why so much money is spent on them. But in addition to that, we have programs that involve citizen scientists. There are websites that you can register on and help big research programs just by looking at data and categorizing things. And you can engage with social media or read blogs. There are often things to do, hands-on activities at science festivals and even music festivals. So science communication has become much, much bigger, and it's a career that one could think of in its own right. Now, my introduction to this field was something like this. Now, you might recognize this young gentleman. This is David Attenborough, and he is giving a Christmas lecture at the Royal Institution. So this was my introduction to science communication. When I was much younger, I used to rush home from school at Christmas time to make sure that I watched these on broadcast TV. And then later in my career, a lot later in my career, I was in Bristol doing my independent fellowship, and I had the opportunity to take a course. It was a 2-day course at a place called TechniQuest. This is the science centre in Cardiff. And that's where I was introduced to some techniques for communicating science to a non-specialist audience. And it might have finished there had the EPSRC not decided to run a pilot program for essentially science communication. Now, the EPSRC stands for the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. They were paying my fellowship. And so this allowed me to apply for money for this grant. And that took me into my first foray into science communication. Now, the first thing about any scientist, we want to be, I know I put lazy here, but efficient is the way. We try to do things as efficiently as possible. And so what I was looking for is a way to give my demonstration lectures without having to book a venue, book an audience, advertise this. And so I was thinking to myself, where can I find a ready-made audience that will do my advertising for me and where I wouldn't have to hire a venue? And I thought, well, my mum is in this institution called the WI, the Women's Institute. And they have meetings once a month, and they have a ready-made venue. They invite a speaker along. And I thought, that's perfect. A group of interested adults. I can develop my lectures, my demonstration lectures that I was going to give about my research, and I can give them to the WI. So I phoned up the WI. I developed one of these lectures. I phoned up the WI and I said, I've got a lecture that I'd like to give. And they said, you need an audition. So I had to pass an audition to be included on their speaker list. Well, I managed to, fortunately, and I was included on their speaker list and started this in about, well, the year 2000. So I managed to get a few gigs then for the WI. And so in 2004, I was sort of getting regular invitations to speak at places. And you can see here that it was about once, maybe twice a month, I would be out speaking at places in the local area. It didn't stop there though, because I had a chance meeting with someone that was on the board of the advisory board of the National Science Festival in South Africa. And this got me a couple of possibilities to speak in South Africa. And by the time 2013 came around, I'd secured what's called a sabbatical. Now, a sabbatical for a university lecturer is a period of time where one doesn't have to teach at university. One's free to go off, and usually it's to do research. Usually on a sabbatical, you go off to a different place in the world to work with people in different labs. But because I was a science communicator, I organized a tour of South Africa. So I spent 3 months driving around South Africa, giving workshops and talks all around the place. And since then, if we look at 2017 onwards, we can see that I've done quite a lot of work in the local area, but also slightly further afield. We have a couple of pins there in Ireland, and there was a tour of Belgium. So that's this little group here. I had a foray into Berlin to a student conference there, and worked with the British Council down in Marseille. Kept up my links with South Africa, but also been to Mozambique. I've worked with our international office at the university and visited Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Also, under the auspices of the international office, I've done some shows in Hong Kong. I've also had the opportunity to teach and spread the word in South Korea. I was there for a week just in one place, working with one group of students, but that was a lot of fun. And more recently, I've been able to get out to New Zealand. In fact, I spent 7 weeks of the summer in New Zealand. I was actually working at a university, but part of that work was to give these science communication science shows. These maps are interactive and they can be found on my website. So if you want to go and zoom in, find out what all different colors mean, you can do it there. So it all started with the Women's Institutes. And from that, I developed talks to give to schools. And from that, I started talking also to the University of the Third Age, which is a bit like a women's institute, but for a completely mixed membership. That I think all you need to be to qualify for the University of the Third Age is retired, but it's a way of keeping mind and body active. There are a lot of groups around the country. I've also been to science festivals, Norwich Science Festival. There's a couple of science festivals I do in South Africa and one really tiny science festival in New Zealand. I've been to teacher conferences in Ireland and in New Zealand. I've worked with the international office of the UEA. That's got me out to Southeast Asia. And of course, I had my sabbatical of 3 months traveling around South Africa. Now I'm involved with an international project about transnational education, trying to help primary teachers in Southeast Asia to increase their STEM awareness and confidence in doing experiments and demonstrations in the primary science curriculum. So we started off with demonstration lectures. We moved on to science shows, which are a lot more flamboyant, a lot more edutainment. I also do workshops where people can come along and build something and take it away, or mix up some chemicals, and try to do some forensic science. Over the years, I've been asked to do these and have built up a range of possibilities. There's also this thing called busking, where you're just out and about in a crowd of people and have a couple of props and show scientific principles and try and get people thinking about science. And that can be a lot of fun. And this is me, known as the kitchen chemist. My most famous science shows are kitchen chemistry, and that little R tells you that it's a registered trademark now, which is quite satisfying. So thank you for your attention. And are there any questions?